I'll never forget that evening. The sky was fading into twilight as I pulled into my driveway, still riding the high of leading a successful seminar. There's something uniquely fulfilling about teaching, standing in front of eager minds, guiding them through the tangled web of literature. I'd spent the day discussing Shakespeare's complex characters. Little did I know, my own life was about to become a twisted tragedy. I was home earlier than expected, which in a normal world would have been a good thing. A pleasant surprise for Jenna, my wife, and our 2 girls. But as I sat in the car, I heard Jenna's voice coming from the open living room window. Her tone, calm, calculated, made me pause. What I heard next shattered the very ground beneath me. "Once I accuse him of abuse," she said, her voice low but firm, "I'll get full custody. He won't see it coming." My hands froze on the steering wheel. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Abuse? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but her next words hit like a sucker punch. "I'll move in with Tom as soon as the papers are filed. Eric's career will be over. I'll take the girls, and he'll be left with nothing." Tom. The name felt like a poison in my veins. I knew him. A smug real estate agent Jenna had mentioned in passing, someone I never gave a second thought. But apparently, while I was busy building a life for us, she had been busy building her escape plan. And now, she was planning to destroy me, professionally, personally, completely. My first instinct was to storm inside, confront her, demand answers. But something, call it instinct, call it years of reading about characters who made rash decisions and paid the price, held me back. This wasn't a moment for emotion. I needed to think, strategize. If Jenna was willing to lie about abuse, to rip my life apart, I had to be smarter. I had to be prepared. I backed the car out of the driveway, my hands shaking as I pulled away from the house. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. The betrayal was like a fire burning in my chest, but I couldn't let it consume me. Not yet. Eventually, I ended up at a coffee shop near the university. My usual haunt. It was quiet, the kind of place where I'd lose myself in grading papers or brainstorming new lectures. But tonight, I wasn't grading papers. I was trying to salvage my life. I ordered a coffee, but didn't touch it. Instead, I sat there, staring at the steam rising from the cup, trying to process what had just happened. The wife I'd loved, the mother of my children, was plotting to accuse me of something so vile, so damaging, that I could lose everything, my family, my career, my dignity. And Tom, this snake, was standing by, ready to swoop in and take my place. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. That's when I called Joan McGregor. Joan McGregor had always been more than just a lawyer. She was the kind of person you called when you needed a bulldog in your corner. We'd met years ago when she guest lectured at the university. Sharp, relentless, and with a knack for seeing right through people. If anyone could help me navigate this storm, it was her. "Eric, you need to be smart about this." Joan's voice crackled through the phone. I could practically hear her brain firing on all cylinders. What Jenna's planning isn't just a divorce. It's character assassination. She's going to use every dirty trick in the book to make sure you lose the kids, your reputation, everything. False accusations of abuse? That's a professional death sentence. "I know," I said, staring at the untouched coffee. "But what do I do?" "You gather evidence," she replied without missing a beat. "If she's willing to lie about abuse, she's capable of much worse. You need proof, surveillance, conversations, anything that shows her true intentions. But, Eric, this has to stay under wraps. If she even gets a whiff of suspicion, she'll flip the narrative on you before you can blink." My mind raced. I was a professor, not a spy. How was I supposed to gather evidence without Jenna realizing? But then again, if I didn't, I'd be walking straight into her trap, blindfolded. Joan's warning echoed in my head. Be methodical. Be careful. Your life depends on it. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't face Jenna. Not yet. Instead, I drove aimlessly before finally pulling into the parking lot of a cheap hotel on the outskirts of town. I sat in the car, staring blankly at the glowing vacancy sign, knowing I was about to step into a world I had never imagined, one where I had to outsmart my wife in a war she had started. The next day, after dropping the girls at school, I returned to the house. Jenna was out, likely off with Tom, so I had time. I went online, researching security cameras. I needed something discreet, something that wouldn't be detected. Within a few hours, I had the equipment in hand. I installed the cameras in places where I knew Jenna wouldn't think to look. One in the kitchen, another in the living room, and a third in the hallway near the bedrooms. It was surreal, setting up surveillance in my own home. But I had no choice. If I didn't act now, Jenna's lies would become the truth, and my life would be over. For the next few days, I played the role of the oblivious husband. I kept up appearances, engaging in the same routine, asking about her day, pretending nothing was wrong. But inside, I was crumbling. The sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the fear of losing my daughters. It was eating me alive. Every smile I forced felt like a dagger twisting in my chest. And Jenna? She didn't even notice. She was too wrapped up in her plan, too confident in her control over the situation. I overheard more of her conversations with Tom, detailing how they'd move in together once the divorce was filed, how Tom would take over my role as the father figure. It was nauseating, but I recorded every word. But even in the midst of all this, life didn't stop. My professional world was also spiraling out of control. The university was facing budget cuts, and the English department, my department, was on the chopping block. Low enrollment, they said. Literature wasn't practical enough. They wanted to cut my program and divert the funds elsewhere. I was handed the task of organizing a high-profile literary festival, a last-ditch effort to prove the value of the department. Normally, this would have been my passion project, the kind of challenge I'd dive into headfirst. But now, my mind was split between saving my career and saving my family. Juggling both was a nightmare. During the day, I was pitching ideas for the festival, trying to convince my colleagues that we could still pull off a miracle. At night, I was reviewing footage from the cameras, listening to Jenna laugh with Tom about how naive I was. The weight of it all was suffocating, but I couldn't crack. Not yet. The tension in the house grew thick. Jenna started to sense that something was off. I noticed her watching me more closely, her smiles a little too forced. One evening, as she was cleaning, she almost found one of the cameras. My heart stopped as I watched from the monitor, but just as she reached for it, the doorbell rang, and she was distracted. I took that as my cue to move it later that night, narrowly avoiding disaster. The more time passed, the bolder Tom became. He started showing up at the house when I wasn't home, leaving subtle reminders of his presence, his jacket draped over a chair, his cologne lingering in the air. And then one morning after I dropped the girls off at school, I found my car tampered with. The brake lines were cut just enough to make it dangerous, but not enough for a casual inspection to notice. Tom wasn't just playing games. He was trying to get rid of me. I was spiraling, but I had no choice but to keep pushing forward. I was running out of time. I had to get to the finish line before Jenna did. The stakes were higher than I could have ever imagined. Every day felt like a race against an invisible clock. Jenna and Tom's plot on one side, my professional life dangling by a thread on the other. I was losing track of the hours, sleeping less, thinking more. The cameras continued to record their treachery. But the deeper I dove into Jenna's world, the more paranoid I became. Tom wasn't just a lover anymore. He was an accomplice. I'd see him pulling up to the house in his shiny, overpriced car, acting like he already owned the place. But it wasn't the cocky grin or the way he made himself comfortable that got to me. It was the feeling that he was always one step ahead. He wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was infiltrating every corner of my life. One night, as I watched the latest footage, I saw it. The moment that made everything feel real in the worst way possible. Jenna and Tom sitting in my living room, drinking my wine. And then, in the calmest voice, Jenna said, "It's almost done. I'll file the papers next week. Eric won't know what hit him. Tom smirked, his voice dripping with arrogance. Good. We'll finally be free of him. I've already lined up a lawyer for you. We'll get full custody of the girls, and he'll be out of the picture for good. I slammed my laptop shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. They were so confident, so assured that I was too weak, too naive to stop them. I had all the evidence I needed to crush their plan. I just had to survive long enough to use it. But then, just as I thought I was in control, the game changed. One evening, I came home from the university, my head swimming with festival planning and legal strategy, only to find the front door slightly ajar. My heart dropped into my stomach as I stepped inside. The house was ransacked. Drawers yanked open, papers scattered across the floor, the eerie silence pressing in on me like a weight. I rushed to the study where I'd hidden the hard drive with all the footage. My hands shook as I pulled open the drawer. It was gone. Panic surged through me like a wave, nearly knocking me off my feet. My only leverage, my proof, the one thing that could save me, stolen. Jenna or Tom must have discovered the surveillance. They were playing dirtier than I anticipated, and now without that hard drive, I was standing on the edge of a cliff. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Joan. I answered, my voice tight with barely contained panic. They found it. The footage, it's gone. All of it. Joan didn't skip a beat. Did you back anything up? I paused, hope flickering for a second. Some of it. The most recent files were uploaded to the cloud automatically. But it's not everything. That's better than nothing, she said, her voice firm. We still have a case. We need to move fast before they pull something else. Can you get me access to those files tonight? I hung up, racing to my laptop to access the cloud backups. My hands were trembling, but eventually I located the recordings. Not all of them, but enough to prove the affair and their plotting. I sent the files to Joan, praying it would be enough. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The house felt hostile, like it wasn't even mine anymore. Jenna had turned our home into a battleground, and I was outnumbered. The next morning, I dropped the girls off at school, their innocent chatter a stark contrast to the storm brewing around them. I had to remind myself this was all for them. I couldn't let Jenna take them away, no matter what. That afternoon, Joan called. We're ready, she said. I've filed for an emergency hearing. You'll get your day in court. But, Eric, be prepared, this is going to get ugly. Ugly didn't even begin to cover it. The next few days were a blur of legal preparations and strained silences at home. Jenna still didn't know I had regained some of the footage. She was confident, smug even. Her plan was in full swing, and I was supposed to be none the wiser. But then, the day came. The courtroom loomed in front of me like a fortress, cold and unyielding. I walked in, my pulse racing, Joan by my side, her expression sharp and focused. Across the room, Jenna sat with her lawyer, a young, hungry professional with the kind of slick smile that made my skin crawl. And there, in the back of the room, was Tom, watching like a vulture, waiting for the kill. The hearing began, and Jenna's lawyer wasted no time painting me as a monster. Your Honor, he began, his voice full of practiced gravitas. This man has not only been emotionally abusive, but has endangered the welfare of his children. His wife, Jenna, has suffered in silence for years, too afraid to speak out. We're here today to ensure she and their daughters are protected from further harm. I could barely keep my composure as Jenna took the stand, tears welling in her eyes, her voice shaking with false vulnerability. She detailed my supposed outbursts, her voice breaking as she described the emotional torment she'd endured. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. The court watched with rapt attention, and I could feel my reputation disintegrating with every word she spoke. But then it was Joan's turn. She stood, her posture radiating confidence as she approached the bench. Your Honor, we have evidence that directly contradicts Mrs. Miller's claims. Evidence that not only exonerates my client, but exposes the true nature of this divorce. She held up a USB drive, and my heart pounded in my chest. The courtroom fell silent as the footage began to play. The damning conversations. Jenna and Tom's blatant affair. Their cruel, calculated discussions about using false accusations to destroy me. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Jenna's lies unraveled in real time. When it was over, the judge's face was unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. Jenna's lawyer scrambled to recover, but it was too late. The truth was out. As the judge adjourned the hearing, it was clear the tide had turned. And Jenna, for the first time, looked afraid. Now, if there's one thing I've learned from teaching Shakespeare, it's that every good tragedy needs a moment of comic relief. Unfortunately for Jenna, this courtroom drama wasn't exactly playing out as she'd scripted. When the footage stopped rolling, her face went from tear-streaked victim to something resembling a student who forgot the entire paper was due yesterday, completely blindsided. As for Tom, sitting in the back like some smug villain from a bad soap opera, the look on his face could only be described as oops, my bad. He didn't realize the show was over, and buddy, let me tell you, he didn't even get a curtain call. The courtroom was deathly quiet for a few long, delicious seconds. You know, the kind of silence where you could hear a pin drop, or in this case, Jenna's plan collapsing like a badly made soufflé. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered she tried to frame me for abuse, steal my kids, and run off into the sunset with Tom. Yeah, sympathy doesn't stretch that far. Jenna's lawyer, poor guy, was sweating through his designer suit as he fumbled for some kind of response. Your Honor, he stammered, shuffling papers like he could somehow pull a new defense out of thin air. Spoiler alert, he couldn't. The evidence was too clear, too damning. And let's be honest, no amount of courtroom theatrics was going to put that genie back in the bottle. Joan, my lawyer, stood there with that "I told you so" look she had mastered over years of eviscerating people like Jenna. Calm, cool, and frankly enjoying this just a little too much. But hey, if anyone deserved to gloat in this moment, it was her. She'd just taken their entire case apart, brick by deceitful brick. The judge, who up until this point had maintained an admirable poker face, finally leaned forward and spoke. "Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice even but dripping with the kind of authority that would make you sit up straighter in your chair. "It appears that your claims lack substantial credibility." Lack credibility? That's putting it mildly. This woman had just tried to sell the court a fairy tale where I'm the big bad wolf. But unfortunately for her, real life doesn't work like Cinderella. There's no fairy godmother to wave a wand and erase all the evidence, though I'm sure Jenna was wishing for one right about now. I didn't have to say a word. The weight of the evidence was doing all the talking. Every whisper of abuse, every fabricated sob story, gone in the blink of an eye, and the courtroom was no longer buying tickets to her show. And then there was Tom. Good old Tom. He must have thought he was going to stroll in here, get the girl, and leave me with nothing but a legal bill and a broken family. I could see him, slouched in the back row, eyes darting between the judge, Jenna, and the exit like he was wondering if he could make a clean getaway. Newsflash, Tom, you picked the wrong team. In fact, if this were a Shakespeare play, this is where the comic relief character, let's call him Tomio, would start backpedaling. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he realized his clever little plot had just crashed and burned. And Jenna? She was too busy watching her case disintegrate to notice that her knight in shining real estate was quietly reaching for his coat, inching toward the exit like someone trying to sneak out of a movie theater before the credits rolled. Honestly, I couldn't have scripted it better myself. When the judge called for a recess, Jenna's lawyer all but collapsed into his chair, probably already drafting his resignation letter. Meanwhile, Tom slipped out the door without so much as a backward glance. I'm sure he thought no one would notice. But oh, we all noticed. And judging by Jenna's face, when she realized Tom had ghosted her, so did she. Joan turned to me, her voice low but sharp. Well, that went better than expected. I couldn't help but crack a smile. Yeah, but I think Tom's auditioning for a different drama now. Joan just chuckled. Let him. We've got this. And she was right. The hard part was over. The next round was just formalities, paperwork, rulings, the boring stuff. Except for Jenna, of course. Her entire world was crumbling faster than I could say alimony. As we reconvened, Jenna's expression had gone from defiant to desperate, and her lawyer had shifted into damage control mode. It was clear they were hoping for some sort of last-minute miracle, but those don't really happen in real life. Not when you've been caught red-handed trying to stage a courtroom coup. In the end, the judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Full custody of the kids went to me. Jenna would be required to pay alimony and child support. And as for her little false abuse claims, well, let's just say those didn't go over well with the court. Perjury is not something you want hanging over your head when you're trying to start a new life with a guy who couldn't even stay through the credits. When the gavel fell, I took a deep breath. It was over. Jenna, still sitting at the defendant's table, looked utterly defeated. But as I walked out of that courtroom, I wasn't thinking about her anymore. I was thinking about my daughters, about finally getting back to something that resembled normal life. Tom? Well, he was long gone by the time I reached the parking lot. I guess he figured ride or die wasn't in the cards after all. With the courtroom drama behind me, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The whole ordeal had been like being stuck in one of those nightmares where you're running, but your legs won't move. Now, though it was over, the weight had lifted, and for the first time in months, I could look at my daughters without that gnawing fear of losing them hanging over my head. But life doesn't slow down just because you've won one battle. The university, as usual, had its own crisis brewing. The literary festival, my Hail Mary to save the English department, was looming closer, and despite everything I'd been through, the pressure was on. We needed to prove that literature wasn't just extra credit in the grand curriculum of life. It was the foundation, the heartbeat of our culture. And wouldn't you know it, in the midst of organizing this festival, I found myself in front of an auditorium packed with students, faculty, and a few skeptical higher-ups from the administration. They had no idea what I'd been through, but standing there, all I could think about was how I'd survived this gauntlet Jenna and Tom threw me into. When I started speaking, something inside me clicked. I talked about the power of literature, how stories are mirrors to our struggles, our victories, our heartbreaks. How, in the words of the greats, we find reflections of our own lives. And let's be real, my life had turned into one hell of a novel. Betrayal, redemption, a dash of courtroom drama. If I wasn't living it, I'd almost enjoy reading it. As the words flowed, something incredible happened. The audience leaned in. They were hooked not just on the importance of literature, but on the raw honesty behind it. It wasn't just Shakespeare or Orwell I was talking about. It was resilience. It was survival. It was getting knocked down and standing back up again. By the time I wrapped up, I could feel it in the room. The tides had turned. The festival was a hit. And just like that, the English department was back on the map. We weren't going anywhere. In the weeks that followed, life started to settle into something resembling normal. Jenna, unsurprisingly, faded into the background. She had her own mess to deal with, financially ruined, and now the proud recipient of a court order to pay child support. Tom? I imagine he slunk back to wherever snakes go after they've been exposed. But for me, the real victory wasn't just in the courtroom or the university. It was in the quiet moments at home, helping my daughters with their homework, tucking them into bed, knowing that no one could take them away from me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. Then one day, out of the blue, I got a call from a publishing company. They'd heard about my story, the betrayal, the legal battle, the professional triumph, and they wanted me to write about it. At first, I hesitated. Did I really want to relive it all on paper? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't the only one who had been through this kind of hell. Maybe my story could help someone else who was staring down the same abyss. So, I wrote. I poured everything into that book. The pain, the anger, the victories, the lessons learned. And when it hit the shelves, it resonated in ways I never expected. It wasn't just about betrayal or legal battles. It was about resilience, about fighting back when the world tries to take everything from you. Months passed, and the book became a bestseller. I started speaking at conferences, sharing my story, not just as a professor of literature, but as someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side. I wasn't just teaching about survival through literature anymore. I was living proof of it. In the end, I realized something. Life doesn't always go the way we plan. Sometimes it throws curveballs, like a wife who plots to ruin you or a career that teeters on the edge of collapse. But if there's one thing I learned, it's this. You can't let the hits keep you down. You get back up. You rebuild. And if you're lucky, you come out stronger than before. As for Jenna and Tom, well, last I heard, they weren't doing so well. But that's not my story anymore. My story is about moving forward, about building a life on my terms with my daughters by my side. And that, my friends, is a story worth telling.